The time is at hand.
The elusive dog-like creature attacks livestock, bleeding them dry of blood.
8 to 10 feet tall, shadowy aliens.
The appearance of a mysterious monolith.
Making it rain by zapping clouds.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen.
Welcome to In Dark Places. I'm still waiting for the Civil War to start. How about you? It's coming. Sometime between now and January 20th. I don't really have anything to complain about this week. Nothing weird at work. The car is still giving me trouble, but that's a given. It always gives me trouble. I have a wheel that's about to fall off this time. Anybody got a spare tie rod end that I can use? We got an action-packed show for you this week. And let's get right to it. Here with the news. My friend and yours, Jimmy Haunted.
Breaking news! Dozens of monkeys escape from South Carolina research facility. Dozens of monkeys have escaped from a research facility in Yemassee, South Carolina, prompting police to urge residents to lock their doors and windows until the primates have been captured.
Urge. I've got the urge.
She's got the urge to burble. She ran the rebel in the shadow.
The Alpha Genesis Primate Research Center is home to the 43 escaped female rhesus macaque primates, which police describe as very young and weighing between 6 and 7 pounds. Bless their little hearts. Bless their monkey hearts. The Yemassee Police Department, in collaboration with Alpha Genesis, have initiated search teams to help locate the escaped primates. Alpha Genesis currently has eyes on the primates and are working to entice them with food, police said in a statement. The public is advised to avoid the area as these animals are described as skittish, and any additional noise or movement could hinder their safe capture. The monkeys have never been used for testing due to their young age, and they're too young to carry diseases, the statement said. Attempts to reach Alpha Genesis for comment went unanswered. Speaking to CBS News, Alpha Genesis CEO Greg Westergaard said that a caretaker accidentally left a door to the enclosure unsecured. The ensuing escape, he said, was like an all too literal version of monkey see, monkey do. It's really like follow the leader, you see one go and the others go, Westergaard said. It was a group of 50, and 7 stayed behind, and 43 bolted out the door. Even though he called the escape frustrating, Westergaard said he hoped the monkeys would ultimately return home of their own free will. No, you know, and In Dark Places listeners, if these little monkeys came up to us, we just want to hug you. This is Mr. Haunted with In Dark Places Monkey News. Back to you, Junebug.
Thanks, Jimmy. What could possibly go wrong? And now, Art Bell gets annoyed.
Chuck was authorized to do what amounted to a mini documentary for CNN.
Okay,
that
all right.
aired
Hold
in
it
early
right there.
85.
Hold it right
the
there.
The only reason I bring it up is because that's where the tape of Colonel Hall recording this thing
all right,
going
Peter,
over
Peter,
the
Peter,
guys.
Peter, hold on. We got a break?
Yep.
All right, good.
Hot off the heels of the bipartisan House hearing on UFOs, this week on the show, Alien Encounters, Chapter 7, sponsored in part by Herbal Essences Shampoo. Yeah. A woman called Mary was driving her car near Norwalk, Connecticut, Jimmy's neck of the woods, in the summer of 1973, when the radio was suddenly filled with strange static interference. She heard a man's voice inside her head and found herself within a huge spacecraft. How she got there, she has no idea. Standing before her was a tall entity with fair hair and dressed in a silver one-piece suit. Styling and profiling. It conversed with her by telepathy, or directly from mind to mind. She was greeted with strange words. "Welcome, my friend, Mary Angel." During the time the witness spent on board the craft, before being returned mysteriously to her car, the alien gave her a tour of his UFO. It was supposedly peopled by no fewer than 200 crew who came from what they called the galaxy of Guantatori Elfi. The aliens prophesied specific floods that would occur in the USA. In due course, the prediction came true. But aliens do not always display such insight. A woman in Belfast, Northern Ireland, was taken on board a UFO in 1976. She was told that Princess Anne would have twins and that Canada was about to join the European Common Market. Needless to say, 5 years later, these extremely unlikely events still had not come to pass. Two men in their late 20s were returning from a night at a friend's house in Palos Verdes, Southern California, during a summer night in the early 1970s. As they were about to drive off, their headlights illuminated two weird shapes on the road. They were the size of basketballs and looked not unlike giant human brains. After observing them for a few seconds, they maneuvered their car around them and hurried on their way. After taking his friend home, a 5-minute journey, the driver continued on his way another 5 minutes, only to discover that 2.5 hours had gone by instead of the expected 10 minutes. The man, whom investigator Ann Druffel calls John Hodges, was put under regressive hypnosis in 1976 to try to restore his detailed memory of the event. He was anxious to find out what had happened to him. In this condition, he described how, when alone in his car, he was taken into a room and conveyed telepathically with one of the brains. "The voice comes from within me, but it sounds like you're talking to me," Hodges said. Some gray-skinned humanoid creatures with webbed features were also present, apparently acting as crewmen. The giant brain showed Hodges advanced three-dimensional holograms depicting nuclear explosions, and explained that atomic power was being misused on Earth. Hodges later remembered that the humanoids were in fact the real controllers, and the brains simply acted as translation devices, alive and yet not quite alive. A miniaturized translator cell was implanted in Hodges' brain on the night of the encounter, which would allow information to flow freely in the future. Eventually he was returned to his car, but his memory was blocked, and he felt a curious buzzing and tingling all over his body. My fiancé, boyfriend at the time, had just gotten home from work. He went into our kitchen, and I walked through the bedroom and into the bathroom, and just stopped for a moment. I had a weird feeling. I still can't really put a name to it. So I called him and asked him to come here. I walked out of the bedroom, and as soon as we came within view of each other, that was it. The next thing we knew, we were both waking up, laying side by side in our bed, flat on our backs, on top of the blankets, and still fully dressed, down to our shoes. 3 hours had gone by. It was so odd and disorienting, and though we had both just come to, we were extremely tired. We joked about the lost time at first, but the more we thought about it, the more weirded out we became about the whole ordeal. I wouldn't say I was abducted by aliens specifically, but I was definitely taken somewhere. It was More of an abduction of consciousness, if that makes any sense. I don't know. It might have been my body, too. It was a weird feeling that I can't really explain. I was sitting at the park one day in broad daylight with 4 or 5 friends. I lived in a small community in the Midwest, so the park was empty except for us. We were talking and smoking, when suddenly everyone just kind of slowed down and eventually froze completely, myself included. I couldn't move or talk. I couldn't blink. I had to focus really hard on just breathing, and then I blacked out. I woke up alone in a dark, nearly pitch-black room with 3 large illuminated screens around me. On the screens I saw the park from above, the exact spot where my friends and I were sitting. It felt like I was in that room for hours until I blacked out again. I finally came to and realized I had been crying hysterically on the ground. The rest of my friends seemed pretty wrecked too, like we all just experienced something really terrifying. I was the first one to speak out. I said, "I think I met God," and they all responded with similar brief statements. I remember one girl saying, "We're on TV somewhere," which expressed the feeling of being watched, unsafe, and violated really well. I can't remember what anyone else said, just the general idea of we got taken somewhere. We didn't talk about it besides one weird short sentence each. That was the strangest part for me, that we didn't talk about it. But we all understood that we had seen the same thing. It felt like we couldn't talk about it, where it/they could see us. We left immediately and haven't spoken about it since. I don't keep in touch with those friends anymore, but it would be interesting to know if they felt like it was an abduction of some kind too. Carol and Steve W. are a young married couple from Gateshead in northeast England in August of 1979. Wait a minute, they're not so young after all. They had cause to become very worried when their home was suddenly invaded. This was no ordinary plague of mice or rats disturbing the normality of their lives. Instead, it involved tiny UFOs and strange alien beings. It began on August 17th. Carol was alone in the house with her 3-year-old daughter, as her husband was working on the night shift. She was unable to sleep because of a searing toothache. The time was about 2 a.m. She went downstairs, made a cup of tea, and sipped it while sitting on her bed. A red light shone through the curtains. Puzzled, she got up and drew them apart, and was amazed to see a symbol-shaped object above the rooftop opposite. The UFO hovered for a while, displaying multicolored lights, and then spiraled upward into the sky. Back in bed, Carol became distressed when a low rumble announced the return of what looked to be the same object, this time in miniature, appearing on the curtains and flying into the room. In its wake was a trail of glittering specks. She felt a tingle on her body and heard a buzzing as the swarm of lights fell toward her. The specks then returned to the 18-inch disc and left the room through the open door. The mini UFO reappeared to Carol 13 nights later, when she went into her daughter's bedroom to settle her back to sleep. The tingling returned, and she screamed to her husband. He arrived just in time to see a flash of light outside the window. The disc had flown out through the window, although it was shut and remained undamaged. 4 nights later, Carol decided that her husband's next night shift could not be tolerated alone, so she went to stay with her mother, who lived nearby. At 4 a.m., she was again paralyzed by the buzzing and tingling as the mini UFO entered the room. This time it was accompanied by 12 weird human-like creatures, 2 feet 6 inches tall. They wore white suits and had pale feminine features. Their hair looked unreal and reminded Carol of an Action Man doll. Some of the beings approached the bed, showed interest in her eyes, and conversed in clicking sounds. The invasion continued for over 2 months. Carol's family felt the tingle and the paralysis at least once, and the dog was sent into a frenzy whenever the buzzing noises enveloped the house. And then, just as suddenly as they began, the experiences mysteriously stopped. On July 5th, 1972, 27-year-old Maureen Putty saw a UFO on the Moraduck Road near Frankston in Victoria, Australia. The object was a huge blue disc which hovered above her car as she returned from visiting her son in the hospital. 20 days later, at almost the same spot, it returned. This time, it seemed to drain power from her car, causing it to stop. The car appeared to steer itself to the roadside. A voice in her head told her, "All your tests will be negative." And it then said, "Tell media, do not panic. We mean no harm." Judith Maggie, a respected researcher, investigated the case, and about 6 months later received a telephone call from Mrs. Putty, asking for an urgent meeting. She said that the voice had called her name and told her to return to Moraduck Road. Judith Maggie went with fellow investigator Paul Norman to meet Mrs. Putty at the scene of the sighting. Mrs. Putty said that on her way to meet the ufologists, a figure in a golden suit had materialized in the car beside her. These guys always have flashy, stylish clothes. I like that. As the investigator sat talking to the woman at the site, she claimed that the entity had returned and was standing in front of the car headlights. Neither researcher could see anything. Mrs. Putty began to describe the scene inside the UFO that she claimed was nearby. Over the next few minutes, she kept alternating between being here, in the car, and there, inside the UFO, although all the time she was physically present with the investigators. Maureen Putty claimed the being wanted her to go with it, which she violently opposed. The researcher sensed the battle going on within her and saw her tears as the situation got too much. Yet, if the testimony of the investigators is anything to go by, although Mrs. Putty felt she was inside a UFO and observing an entity, this experience had no reality outside her mind. I was about 15. Every night, a guy I'll call Jay and I would sneak out at about midnight and go back home around 4 or 5 in the morning before our parents would wake up for work. On one particular night, we had just snuck out and it was about 1 a.m. We headed to my backyard, laid on the trampoline, and stared at the stars and talked like we always did. Now, if you're in a room right now and you look around, you'll see the definite 4 corners where your ceiling and walls meet. You can see how square they turn. Edge of wall, sharp turn, second wall, same with your ceiling. You can see each individual flat surface. The sky did that. It went from staring at the stars to looking like a cube of sky. From the southeast corner of the sky came this giant UFO. I mean, huge, as if it took up a quarter of the whole entire sky. We both stared at it in dead silence. It didn't make any noise, even as it moved, and while it spun, it was only hovering straight. The spinning didn't move like you imagine a frisbee doing. The sides just turned while it moved. I guess what it looked like doesn't really matter. But Jay and I had our eyes dead set on it. We didn't say a word. We didn't point to show the other person. As it began coming toward us, we both flipped over. Again, no hints, no talking, no eye contact. In total sync, we flipped onto our stomachs and stayed as flat and quiet as we could. Now ducking from something sounds totally normal and instinct, but that's not what this was like. It was literally almost like telepathy. I can remember us having a mental conversation of stay flat and it won't see us. Don't move. We watch it make a weird angled C shape across the sky, and although it felt totally in slow motion, it could have been only a few minutes, because I think both of us held our breath the entire time. Now for the weirdest part. As soon as it was out of sight, boom, daybreak. We had literally just gotten to the yard, and I know it was 1:15 because I checked. But the minute we felt released from laying flat, it was very bright, like 7:30 or 8 o'clock bright. I don't remember talking to him at all afterward, other than making eye contact, and then making a break for our homes before our parents noticed we weren't there. A few weeks, even months maybe, I'm talking to my brother's girlfriend about what happened. Apparently she's real into this stuff, but also completely terrified. She said the fact that it felt like a few minutes, but then it was suddenly 6 or 7 hours later, truly 100% makes her think that we were abducted. She was serious. I made a joke about how I should go to hypnotherapy to unblock the memories. And she deadpans and says, don't. People who were abducted are traumatized by what happened to them. They even get PTSD. The next day she texted me about how she couldn't sleep. I think abduction is a little bit of a stretch. And she watched too many Discovery Channel documentaries. But the weird loss of time still irks me. I do know that what we saw was 100% real. Aliens? I don't know. Abduction? I don't know. American Indian shamans, like Black Elk of the Ugala Sioux, believed that they could travel from Earth to other worlds via a cosmic pillar, often symbolized by a pole or a tree. Black Elk often chose a spot beside a tree to begin his trances. Shortly, a spirit guide in the form of a bird would lead him upward through a tunnel-like aperture and further upward into a flaming rainbow teepee, where Black Elk met and communicated with a group of grandfathers. At this point, in many accounts, the shaman is forced to undergo painful bodily dismemberment. A demon removes every organ, bone, and even blood cell in his body. But everything is then replaced after being cleansed and purified, and the shaman is spiritually and physically reborn, ready to return to his people with renewed spiritual energies. Sometimes Black Elk was returned on a little cloud. Clearly, abduction stories such as these, extraordinarily similar to UFO abduction narratives, with their echoes of the events that accompany birth, the perennial events, have been around for a very long time. Those people who believe that UFO abductions relate to alien beings, parallel universes, or other exotic origins will eventually have to explain, along with the lack of unambiguous physical evidence, why the incidents and images reported by abductees are so similar to those reported in a variety of obviously psychological processes, including drug-induced hallucinations, near-death experiences, religious and metaphysical ecstasies, and shamans' trances, like Black Elk's. When I was in 6th grade, I woke up one day with 4 very small holes in my upper right thigh. It looked like the skin had been cut out in perfect tiny circles, yet there was no blood. The circles were in a straight line and across my thigh horizontally, no more than 6 inches wide completely. I also felt tired and couldn't remember what I had dreamt, which is weird for me since I pretty much remember every dream I have every night. I put band-aids on them and I went to school as usual. The next morning I wake up and there are 3 new holes right above the previous 4. I woke up again, very tired and drowsy, and was now weirded out by how symmetrical everything was that I had shown my mom, who said it was most likely ant or spider bites. Next morning, 2 more holes above the previous 3, and the morning after that, 1. This is when I was seriously scared, since the holes now formed a triangle that pointed to my knee, and they weren't scabbing over. I was so tired and confused, and was scared to go to bed, so I stayed up really late. But I woke up the next morning, not even knowing when I had fallen asleep. Only dark, and then morning. When I did wake up, I was suddenly very alert, and when I threw my blanket off my legs, I found all the holes completely gone. No scabbing or scarring, or any trace of circles on my thigh. I showed my mom, and she just brushed it off, as if they had healed like any other cut. I'm honestly not sure if this is related, but I do feel there is a correlation. After this, I couldn't really comprehend math anymore. I had excelled at math all my life, but after this incident, it was like numbers had no meaning to me, and I couldn't figure out simple equations. I went to an advanced school, and had been learning algebra and geometry, and was doing great, but then, it was like, poof, All of my math knowledge and comprehension was gone. Till this day, I can't even do simple addition problems without double-checking them. At about 7 p.m. on January 25th, 1967, Mrs. Betty Andreessen of South Ashburnham, Massachusetts, was allegedly abducted from her living room by a group of alien beings. Her abduction began with a bright light that flashed outside her house, shortly after which a group of 4 feet tall beings appeared. They communicated with Betty and then floated her outside into a waiting craft, where she was examined, immersed in a liquid, and then apparently taken for a journey into alien realms. At the climax of her adventure, she witnessed a huge bird that spoke to her and then, phoenix-like, was consumed in flames, an event that Betty, a devout fundamentalist Christian, interpreted in religious terms. She heard a voice that she thought was God's, saying, "I have chosen to show you the world," apparently because of her sincere faith. After this, Betty's captors returned her home safely. The alleged abduction had lasted about 3 hours and 40 minutes. An event linked with perinatal imagery occurred in what Betty described as the cylindrical room, where she was enclosed in a clear plastic chair with a fitted cover, which her captors filled with a gray fluid. She breathed through clear tubes that fitted into her nostrils and mouth. A telepathic voice told her to close her eyes. Suddenly she felt pleasant vibrations. She was fed some sweet substance through the tube in her mouth, and she was relaxed and happy, floating and tranquil. She became one with the undulating fluid. After a time, the fluid was drained, and she was taken out, and she realized that her head hurt. The scene was interpreted as a return to the womb. Betty spent much of her time on board the UFO, floating from one womb-like room into another, through tunnels and on elevators or other counterparts of the birth canal. Betty's tunnel varied in length, but typically ended with doorways into brightly lit, dome-shaped rooms, where she was undressed, examined, or cleansed. The doorways suggest the cervical opening, usually a bare wall, seemed to separate with a soft whoosh on approach and unite again afterward, leaving no trace. Other openings Betty described include a circular membrane and some mirror-like doors through which she crashed harmlessly. During the medical examination that Betty alleges she underwent in a big bright room, the aliens inserted needle-tipped tubes into her nasal cavities and into her navel. In a hypnotic session conducted later by investigators, Betty remembered the experience. "I can feel them moving that thing. He's going to put it in my navel. Oh, I don't like this. I can feel them moving that thing around in my stomach or my body. Oh, he's pushing that again, around. Feeling things. Feels like he's going right around my stuff inside. Feeling it. Or something with a needle." Betty was told by the aliens that the naval probe was a test for procreation, and afterward she was told that there was some missing parts. Betty had had a hysterectomy and was evidently reliving her own medical history. But the navel also commonly appears as an analog of the umbilical cord in abduction reports. The aliens said they were awakening something with their probing, an element of death and rebirth that was articulated in Betty's case more clearly by the phoenix. In Betty's vision, a worm emerged from the ashes of the phoenix. At the same time, 2 things seemed to be happening to her, both well-established prenatal events. She felt an intense, shivering chill come over her, when only a moment before she had been complaining of intense heat, and the worst thing I've ever experienced. I was camping in a campground in North Georgia with some friends. It was starting to downpour, so everyone left their tents in the woods and decided to rent one of those on-site cabins for everyone to sleep in. I decided I'd just sleep in my car because they wanted to stay up late, and I was tired from kayaking all day. I woke up to the rain stopping, and it was kind of cold in the car, and I had forgotten my sleeping bag in my tent. I checked the cabin to see if there was any room left, and the light was on, and everyone was fast asleep at 3 a.m., the witching hour. I didn't want to squeeze in, so I decided to trek back to my tent in the dark with a small pin light. In order to get to my tent, I had to pass by everyone else's that they had left. Mine was the last one, and even then was 50 feet at least from the previous tent before that. I got to my tent, covered up in my sleeping bag, and prepared to catch the last few hours of sleep before sunrise. No more than 10 to 15 minutes of me getting in my tent, I began to hear light whispers right outside the tent door. They were in English, and to my recollection, indecipherable. Not any language that I had heard at all. Just as the voices started, two orbs appeared together outside the tent. They weren't the same glare as flashlight would make, and both were of two different colors that, to the best of my ability, had no real distinct color, just colorful. The whispers outside the tent began arguing louder and louder between each other, but still in hushed tone. And as the whispers grew louder, the lights began swirling around the tent. Behind me, to the side, to the front. Not in the movement that one can make with a flashlight. And at this point I realized no footsteps could be heard. I uncovered myself and knelt on the tent floor, preparing for the zipper to come undone, like in some kind of horror movie. And I was flipping through my mind on what option to take. I was the most terrified I had ever been. Fight or flight. The lights swirled faster and the voices grew louder, but still breathy and whispery. My mind raced, and I was sweating despite the cold. And then, just like that, the lights shut off, like a switch. And the whisper stopped, and nothing but silence of an empty wood. I stood there as still as I could, and I didn't dare go outside the tent till the sun came up. It was, and still is, the scariest moment of my life. Interestingly enough, I went to a horror movie premiere, Beacon Point, recently, and there was a scene that had the voices in it, and goosebumps ran up my arm. It was identical. The story of the Sunderland family from Oakenholt, North Wales, is a complex and incredible one. It provides a neat encapsulation of the many difficulties in trying to suggest how such experiences occur. Every member of the family, both parents and all 5 children, have claimed involvement in at least one paranormal event during the period of 1976 to 1981. On occasions, more than one person witnessed the same event, but most often it was a solitary experience. These events took many forms, most importantly UFO sightings, but also mild poltergeist outbreaks, and a vast assortment of associated anomalies. 3 of the children claim to have had independent contact with different alien races, including ground landings, communication, and even actual trips to other realms of being. The principal focus has been the oldest girl, Gaynor, who has experienced direct contact, has visited an alien zoo, been taken for a ride on board a disc-like UFO, taken on a guided tour of an alien city, suffered time dislocations, and even produced apparently paranormal effects on photographic film. What is particularly interesting is that Gaynor says she has always been psychic. Since a baby, she has seen what might be called UFOs or ghosts. She claims to see the aura around the human body. At first, she assumed all these things were normal, so she had no cause to suspect she was different. Gaynor has been observed in the middle of one of her trips to an alien world. Her mother saw her at the time and says she was in bed in a strange trance-like sleep. It does seem that alien contacts experienced by the Sunderlands have a direct relation with the other paranormal events. It is reinforced by the fact that in an amazingly high percentage of UFO contacts, the central recipient has a history of claimed psychic experience, which continues after the events that they initially report. This happened to me when I was 10 years old in Calgary, Alberta in 1970. I was walking home from school, cutting across the school sports field. Our house wasn't far. We lived across the street from the school. There wasn't any other kids around, since I had stayed late for volleyball practice, and the rest of the students had gone home 45 minutes earlier when school let out for the day. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon. Something caught my attention from the corner of my eye, and I stopped and turned to my right to look at it. Floating directly above a house facing the schoolyard was a large UFO. I was in the middle of the football field, so this was about 60 to 70 yards distant from where I stood. The UFO was big and almost touching the roof of the house. It is completely centered on the house, but it is so big it is also above the house on the left and right. The lots are 50 feet wide, plus the UFO about 150 feet across, and perhaps 25 to 30 feet tall. It was very bright, giving off a harsh white light, which is difficult to look at since it hurts my eyes. I look away back toward my house and see a car and a motorcycle on the side of the street, which intersects the street with the UFO. The street is about a half a block away, and I remember being surprised and confused that the drivers are not reacting to the UFO, which clearly must be visible to them, and was so obvious, since it was so bright. But the traffic continued as normal. At that point I become aware that something is forcing my head to turn back toward the UFO. I'm turning and my field of view is changing, but I'm not the one doing it. I struggle to turn away, but I simply can't control any of my body. I remember a feeling of panic, and then, the next thing that I can remember, I'm walking to my house. It's about 9:30 at night, and dark outside. I can't recall anything of the last 5 hours. My parents were furious with me for being so late. Apparently my parents and my 2 brothers had been trying to find me for hours. A voice/thought in my head tells me to tell them that I'm not feeling well and that I need to go to bed. I have no idea where the voice/thought come from, but I do exactly as it suggests and run upstairs to my room and go to bed. The next day I can't seem to explain what happened, and my mother is even more angry with me since my new school shoes are ruined, since the tops of them are all scuffed and dirty, like I was dragged face down across the ground with my feet still dragging on the ground. I told my older brothers what happened, and they suggested I keep quiet about it since nobody would believe me. Good advice. It turns out, since in the many years since, most of the people I have shared the story with don't really know what to say afterward. Many years later, I was looking at my old school workbooks from that time, and they are full of drawings of UFOs, all of the same design, and with more detail than I can recall from memory. For example, in my memory, I can't see any of the windows of the UFO, since the light was too bright to make out the details. But in my drawings, there were large round windows all around the UFO, some with faces looking out. A few months after my experience in the schoolyard, something strange happened. In the middle of the night, perhaps 2 a.m., there was a loud bang coming from the attic or roof. I remember feeling the house shake. My brother, in the bedroom next to mine, called out, "What is that?" And that was the last thing I remember. Early the next day, our neighbor comes over to find out if we were all right and asks what was on our house last night. Apparently he saw something big on our roof, but for some reason couldn't describe it. Whenever I tried to explain, he got agitated and frustrated. He said it was like trying to explain music to a person who had been deaf their entire life, except even more difficult. There have been many other sightings of strange things I can't explain, but I'm not sure if they are UFO/alien related or something else, and I'm not the only one in my family that has experienced them. My father also had a number of strange things happen to him that he couldn't explain. Here is one of those from my father. In the Second World War in Europe, he is leading a small group of soldiers along the road. Ahead of him, the road climbs up and over a hill. They start up the road, climbing the hill, but my father gets a strange feeling, and then a detailed picture comes into his head of what is over the hill. All of a sudden he knows that just on the other side of the hill is a small village, and that there is a German ambush just before the village. You can see all the details of the village, the location of the enemy ambush, etc. So my dad's group of soldiers leave the road, make a slow detour around the side of the hill, and come up on the German soldiers from behind. Everything was exactly as it appeared in the vision that my dad had seen before, even though he had never been there before in his life. I asked my dad what happened next to the German soldiers. He wouldn't talk about the fighting and killing. All he would say is that his guys went home after the war, and they didn't. Hey, that's about all the show this week. We are woefully out of time. Thanks for listening. Thanks as always, Jimmy Haunted. We'll see you again right here next week. God bless.